CEO in disguise as black employee is mistreated by staff. Then he reveals his true identity. Marcus Hayes had always felt that he had arrived. At 42, he was the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the country, a thriving business that had rapidly grown from a small startup to an industry leader. He sat in the corner office on the top floor of the sleek, glass and steel building, watching the bustling city streets below through his panoramic windows. The view was one of success, an embodiment of the hard work, sacrifices, and endless nights spent building a company from the ground up. It was a reflection of what he had achieved and how far he had come. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. He had not always been this fortunate. As a child, Marcus had been raised in a modest neighborhood where the odds were stacked against him. His parents, both immigrants from the Caribbean, had worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. They instilled in him the value of education, persistence, and, most importantly, the belief that the sky was the limit. But despite their best efforts, Marcus was always painfully aware that opportunities were often reserved for people who looked like the majority. He grew up in a world where the notion of exceptionalism seemed reserved for white people. It was a harsh reality he would face as he worked his way up through the ranks of predominantly white institutions. His rise to the top was not just about intelligence or hard work. It was about navigating and sometimes overcoming barriers that many of his peers never had to contend with. Now, as CEO, Marcus had the power to change the very systems that had made his journey so difficult. But in the comfort of his corner office, surrounded by accolades, reports, and the occasional flurry of congratulatory emails, he often found himself struggling with an uncomfortable truth. Despite all he had achieved, he wasn't fully sure how far he had really come. There was a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that no matter how much success he had amassed, there were still certain walls that remained between him and his employees. He couldn't shake the feeling that, in their eyes, he wasn't just Marcus Hayes, the CEO. He was always going to be Marcus Hayes, the black CEO. Marcus had worked hard to earn the respect of his colleagues. He was known for being brilliant, a visionary with a knack for turning ideas into action. His board meetings were often intense but productive, his ideas cutting edge, his decisions sharp. The people who worked with him knew he was a force to be reckoned with. He had built relationships with clients and investors who admired him for his intellect and business acumen. But the everyday office dynamics, the interactions with the lower-level employees, the ones who made the office hum with activity, were different. With them, there was a certain formality that felt forced. Despite the company's supposed commitment to diversity and inclusion, Marcus couldn't help but feel the subtle currents of discomfort that rippled through the office when he walked past his employees. He was hyper-aware of his presence in the workplace, especially in a company that prided itself on having a diverse workforce. On one hand, he was proud to have risen to this level. He was an example of what could be accomplished, even for someone like him. Yet, on the other hand, there were times when he felt as though he were an anomaly, a rare exception that some employees might only half accept because of his accomplishments rather than his race. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he could sense the judgment in the eyes of his staff, the way their expressions seemed to shift when they realized he was standing behind them, listening in on a conversation or observing a meeting. It was never overt. It was never loud or confrontational. It was more subtle, insidious even, like the way someone might unconsciously clutch their purse a little tighter when a black man walked into an elevator. These moments were fleeting, but they stung nonetheless. It wasn't as though Marcus hadn't faced challenges before. He had faced countless obstacles, both professionally and personally, on his path to success. He had to fight for every opportunity. There were moments in his career when he had been told, subtly but unmistakably, that he wasn't quite the right fit, or that the job he sought had already been filled by someone with more experience, or better cultural alignment. He had learned early on that being a black man in corporate America was a challenge that few people truly understood. He had fought, tooth and nail, to prove that his abilities and qualifications were equal to or superior to his peers, but it had never been easy. It wasn't just about getting the job, It was about being seen as worthy of the job in a world that had a tendency to value people of color less than their white counterparts. Despite this, Marcus had found a way to navigate the corporate landscape, using his intellect, charisma, and work ethic to rise above. And it worked. He had become the youngest CEO in the company's history, a position that had once seemed impossible for someone who looked like him. Yet, despite the triumph, something about his rise to the top still felt incomplete. He couldn't fully shake the feeling that the world he had fought so hard to be a part of didn't truly accept him. It was as though his achievements were always tied to an asterisk. The Black CEO, the rare exception in a world dominated by white leadership. This discomfort was amplified by the very diversity initiatives that his company had put in place. Marcus had advocated for those initiatives. He had championed them. He had pushed for hiring practices that were more inclusive, for training programs designed to reduce bias in the workplace, for mentorship programs that supported young Black professionals. Yet, Marcus knew that systemic racism wasn't something that could be erased with a few initiatives or token gestures. The bias was embedded deeper into the very culture of the workplace, and that was something no amount of diversity training could fully address. And so, there he was, sitting in his office one afternoon, flipping through a series of employee evaluations. His office was quiet, as it often was during the late afternoon, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to reflect. The evaluations were glowing. His employees were loyal, motivated, and high-performing. There was even a mention of how his leadership style had inspired many of them. Yet, as he glanced at the names of his employees, most of whom were white or Asian, he couldn't help but feel a slight pang. He was proud of their accomplishments, of course, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his leadership was more of a novelty than a norm. After all, how many Black CEOs could one company truly have? That evening, as he was about to leave for the day, Marcus overheard a conversation between two junior employees in the hallway. He had been walking toward the elevator when he paused, hearing their voices as they spoke in low tones. They didn't see him. He had blended in well enough in his suit that they assumed he was just another executive. They were talking about the company's recent expansion into international markets, and one of the employees was recounting a recent meeting with a major client. "You know, it's impressive how well he's done for someone like him," one of them said, referring to Marcus. The other employee paused before responding. "Yeah, I know. I mean, it's incredible that a Black guy is the CEO of a company this big. It's like you never see that." The comment hung in the air like a punch, though neither of the employees seemed to realize the weight of their words. Marcus felt a sharp sting in his chest, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. He had been part of their world for years now, but in that moment, it was clear that he was still an outsider, someone whose race defined him more than his role. He wasn't Marcus Hayes, the CEO. He was Marcus Hayes, the Black CEO, and that distinction still mattered more than anything else. He quickly stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so comfortable in his own skin. As the elevator doors closed, Marcus's mind raced. That conversation had been the catalyst, the inciting moment that pushed him to consider something he'd never thought about before. He had always been the exception. He had always been the one who had overcome the odds. But what if the system itself, the very system that had allowed him to rise, was the same system that was keeping others like him from even getting a foot in the door? What if the reason he had made it wasn't entirely because of his brilliance, but because the corporate world had accepted him as an anomaly, a rare success story that could be pointed to as evidence that everything was fine? Marcus couldn't ignore the question any longer. What would happen if I wasn't the exception? What would happen if, for a day, he was treated like just another Black employee, without the buffer of his title, his office, or his carefully constructed persona? Into uncharted territory, ready to strip away the title and the power that came with it. The decision wasn't a simple one. For years, he had prided himself on the company he had built, the empire he had carved from nothing. But tonight, as the weight of his reflection stared back at him, he realized how little he truly knew about the lives of the people who worked beneath him. The office, with its gleaming glass walls and polished marble floors, had become a fortress, separating him from the very essence of the organization he had spent his life cultivating. As the CEO, Marcus was accustomed to being the one who made decisions, who dictated the direction of the company. But the distance between him and the workforce had grown so vast that he could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that perhaps his success hadn't been solely due to his skills or hard work. Maybe there had been privileges he hadn't fully recognized, opportunities that were more accessible to him because of his background, his race, or the expectations placed upon him by society. The realization was unsettling. Marcus knew that he had to confront these questions, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the integrity of the company. If he were truly going to be a leader, he needed to understand the ground-level realities of those who kept the business running. And so, with a quiet resolve, he closed his eyes for a moment and steeled himself for what was to come. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, not just for his company, but for himself. He was about to step out of his comfort zone, out of the lofty boardrooms and polished executive suites, into a world that demanded humility and truth. The following morning, Marcus Hayes sat at his desk in his corner office, staring at the sprawling cityscape that had become so familiar to him. He had always found peace in the view. The streets below, filled with bustling pedestrians, cars, and cyclists, were a sharp contrast to the quiet serenity of his top-floor sanctuary. From his vantage point, he could control it all. The office was pristine, everything in its place. His team, his assistants, his management, everything worked seamlessly, and he had the privilege of being the orchestrator. From here, Marcus felt a sense of power, of clarity. But today, his mind was far from calm. The conversation he had overheard the previous day still echoed in his thoughts. The words of the two junior employees were now deeply ingrained in his mind. "It's impressive how well he's done for someone like him," one had said. "A black guy as CEO of a company this big. You never see that." The words were casual, spoken almost as a compliment, but to Marcus, they cut deeper than any criticism could. They were a reminder of the underlying truth he had never quite been able to ignore. No matter how successful he became, he was always going to be seen first and foremost as a black man in a position of power, not a man in a powerful position. It wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered this kind of thinking. Over the years, he had been constantly aware of the unspoken assumptions people made about him, both within his company and in broader professional circles. He had worked tirelessly to prove himself. He had met every challenge with vigor and determination, outworking his colleagues, developing a reputation for sharp decision-making and visionary leadership. And yet, no matter how much he accomplished, he always felt as if a part of him, the most essential part, remained overlooked. To the world, Marcus Hayes, the black CEO, was a rare exception, a success story. He had become the face of the company, a symbol of what diversity could look like at the highest levels. His position, though hard one, carried a certain novelty with it. He was proud of everything he had accomplished, but the weight of it all often felt like a double-edged sword. People acknowledged his success, but how much of it was based on his merits versus how much was tied to the rarity of his race and position? How much of it was due to the fact that he was still, in the minds of many, an anomaly? The thought lingered like a shadow, making him question the nature of his success. As he stared out the window, lost in thought, Marcus realized something. He wanted more than just to be seen as a token. He didn't want to be exceptional merely because of the color of his skin or the fact that he had defied the odds. He wanted to be seen for who he was, a brilliant CEO, a leader capable of inspiring and guiding a company to greatness. He wanted to know what it would feel like to be truly respected for his abilities and not just for his rarity. He had achieved so much, but the question that gnawed at him was, what if people didn't actually see me? What if they only saw my race and the story it told? What if, beneath all the praise and accolades, there were still people who doubted him, simply because of the color of his skin? This inner conflict stirred something inside him, a desire to know what life would be like if he wasn't the exception, if he could experience what it was like to be just another employee in the company, treated the same way as anyone else. The more he thought about it, the more the idea seemed like the only way to truly understand the dynamics at play in his workplace. He needed to see for himself. If his position as CEO and the privileges that came with it shielded him from the reality that others faced, then it was time to take action. In the past, Marcus had been so focused on breaking barriers that he never stopped to consider whether his success was a reflection of his hard work or a byproduct of an environment that had made him an exception to a larger, unspoken rule. But now, he was determined to understand what it would be like to walk in the shoes of his employees. More specifically, he wanted to understand what it would be like to be treated like a Black employee in a predominantly white, corporate environment. He knew that, in many ways, his position was a comfortable one. As CEO, he had a voice that people listened to. His opinions were valued, his decisions respected. He wasn't subject to the same microaggressions or biases that his junior employees likely faced daily. His success had placed him above that, at least in the eyes of those who saw him as an exception. But what about the people who didn't have the luxury of a corner office, who didn't have a seat at the table? What about the employees whose stories were ignored or dismissed? What about those whose faces were rarely seen in leadership meetings and whose voices were frequently drowned out by the louder, more privileged ones? Marcus thought about his employees, his colleagues who worked long hours, toiling behind the scenes, often in silence. How many of them had stories to tell that he had never heard? How many had been passed over for opportunities, overlooked because they didn't fit a certain mold, or were too often dismissed because of their race or background? How many of them, like him, had worked hard to get where they were, but still faced systemic obstacles they couldn't overcome? He needed to understand what their experiences were really like. It wasn't just about empathy anymore. He wasn't interested in playing the part of the well-meaning CEO who occasionally parroted phrases about diversity and inclusion in board meetings. He was already that person. He had already established himself as someone who supported those initiatives. But that wasn't enough. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear. He needed to see the world from their perspective. He needed to know firsthand what it was like to be underestimated, to be passed over, to be made to feel like an outsider. The idea took shape in his mind slowly at first, and then with a rush of clarity. Marcus would go undercover. He would enter the company as just another employee, without the title of CEO, without the protective shield of power that came with his role. For a week, maybe 2, he would live their lives. He would do the jobs that they did, interact with his colleagues as just another face in the crowd, and feel the full weight of being just another employee in a system that had been designed to cater to the privileged. He would see if the biases that he suspected were truly pervasive. He would understand how much of his success had been due to his race, and how much was a result of his leadership skills. There was, of course, a risk in this plan. His identity could be exposed at any moment, and there was no way to predict how his employees would react if they discovered who he really was. But that uncertainty only made Marcus more determined. If he was going to lead the company into the future, he needed to understand the challenges his employees faced. He needed to know how deeply ingrained the systemic issues were within the company, and he couldn't do that from the comfort of his corner office. He was also motivated by something deeper, a need to reclaim his sense of authenticity. The truth was, Marcus had always felt like he was playing a role. As the CEO, he had to present a certain image, polished, perfect, and always in control. But beneath the surface, he knew he was far from that ideal. He was a man constantly juggling his identity as a Black leader in a world that often failed to see him as just a leader. He wanted to remove the layers of pretense, the armor he had built over the years, and face the reality of the workplace from the ground up. The following morning, Marcus Hayes arrived at work well before the usual rush of employees. The office, which would soon fill with the hum of chatter and the click-clack of keyboards, was quiet and still. He stood in the lobby for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings, the gleaming glass walls, the polished floors, the open layout designed to foster collaboration and transparency. The office had always felt like a reflection of him, his company, his vision, his success. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt foreign. Marcus adjusted the name tag pinned to his shirt. It was simple, plain, almost anonymous, just Marcus. No last name, no titles. It was a deliberate choice. He wanted to be seen as just another employee, to blend in with the crowd, to experience the office from the perspective of someone who didn't wield authority, someone whose presence didn't demand immediate attention. He wasn't the CEO today. He wasn't the face of a company. He was just another worker trying to navigate a system that, on any given day, might overlook him. As he stepped through the door and into the open-plan office, Marcus felt the weight of his decision. His heartbeat quickened, but he pushed the nerves down. It was important to keep calm, to not draw attention to himself. He knew what it was like to walk these halls as the man in charge, to command respect, to be seen as the one with all the answers. But now, for the first time in years, he was an outsider. He wasn't the one in control, he was, in a way, vulnerable. The first few hours of the day were a blur of routine tasks. Marcus moved with practiced ease, quickly becoming immersed in the work at hand. He answered emails, sorted through the piles of paperwork on desks, made coffee in the break room. It was as though he had stepped into another world entirely. In the back of his mind, he knew that if anyone were to recognize him, this experiment would be over before it began. He had to keep his head down, stay invisible. Despite his efforts to remain unnoticed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His interactions with his colleagues were polite but distant. He overheard fragments of conversations, the kind of office banter that seemed so casual on the surface, yet carried subtle weight. One conversation caught his attention in particular. A junior employee, a white man, was speaking to his friend in the break room. "Have you seen the new guy? He's a bit different, right? I mean, do you think he's really up to the task?" The comment was innocent enough, but the underlying judgment was palpable. "You think he's going to last?" Marcus fought the urge to react, to step in and correct the assumptions. But he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he swallowed his pride and continued with his work. He wasn't sure whether it was the familiarity of the comment or the subtle racism embedded in it that made his stomach churn. But it stung nonetheless. He was different. As though that was something to be pointed out, something that made him stand apart from the rest. In the hours that followed, the reality of what he had undertaken began to set in. Every action, every word spoken to him, was laced with a quiet but undeniable tension. The stares, the whispered judgments, the quiet assumptions. It was as if Marcus had suddenly become invisible in a way that was less about being ignored and more about being reduced to something less than human. He wasn't just new or different, he was the other. One thing became clear as the day wore on. Marcus was being treated differently. Subtly, of course, but it was there, in the way people interacted with him. He wasn't asked to participate in any meaningful conversations. His opinions were disregarded. People didn't seem to value his input the way they would if they knew he was the CEO. They looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, as if trying to figure out who he was, what he was doing there. He overheard someone say, "Is he even qualified? I've never seen him before." The line between what was professional and what was personal blurred in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. It was one thing to read about the realities of racism in the workplace. It was another to experience it firsthand, in the small, often overlooked moments that made up the daily fabric of office life. He had read the studies, seen the reports, but now he was living it, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. When he finally ventured to the elevator to grab lunch, he found himself standing beside a senior manager, someone he had known for years but never worked closely with. The man, a tall, well-dressed individual in his mid-40s, gave Marcus a cursory glance before turning his attention back to his phone. For a brief moment, Marcus felt the familiar pang of isolation. He was invisible in a way that was disconcerting. Then, just as the elevator doors closed and the two were descending to the ground floor, the senior manager spoke. "You know, I don't understand why they keep hiring all these minorities. They're so quick to promote them, but they're always so well behind. It's like they have the talent, but they don't have the confidence to back it up. Like they always need someone to hold their hand." The word stung, but it wasn't just the racism that rattled Marcus. It was the casualness of the remark, the ease with which it was said. As though this was just another fact of life, another piece of office gossip. The manager didn't even seem to realize the weight of his words, the harm they could cause. Marcus stood there, silent, fighting to maintain his composure. The elevator ride felt like it lasted an eternity. It was then, as he stepped off the elevator and made his way toward the break room, that the gravity of the situation fully sank in. The company he had built, the progressive image he had worked so hard to cultivate, was still filled with deeply entrenched biases. This wasn't just about isolated incidents of racism. It was about a culture, a mindset that permeated the workplace at every level. The biases weren't always explicit, but they were there beneath the surface, in every look, every comment, every assumption. Marcus had walked into this experiment expecting to uncover some minor disparities, but what he was seeing now was far more insidious. He was beginning to understand that systemic racism wasn't just a set of overt actions or blatant discrimination. It was a quiet, unspoken presence that shaped every interaction, every decision, every conversation. And it was something that, as the CEO, he had never fully understood. He had always assumed that his success had been earned on merit, that his position as CEO was a testament to his abilities, his vision, and his perseverance. But now, as he witnessed firsthand how others were treated, he couldn't help but wonder how much of his success had been influenced by the fact that he was not just any black man, but the exception, the rare case of someone who had made it. What had it taken for him to get to this point? Was it truly his skill alone, or had he been given opportunities that others, despite their talents, would never have had? The question loomed large, and Marcus had no answers. The rest of the day passed in a haze, each interaction reinforcing the feeling of alienation he had been battling since he entered the building. He sat at his desk, responding to emails with mechanical precision, listening to conversations that seemed to swirl around him without ever including him. He watched as white employees discussed the latest projects, laughed together in groups, and casually ignored the handful of Black and Hispanic employees who were relegated to menial tasks or left out of the more engaging, high-profile work. The disparities were stark, and the realization that these disparities were not accidental but built into the very structure of the company left Marcus reeling. By the end of the day, Marcus was exhausted, not from the work itself, but from the emotional toll it had taken. He had experienced something profound and deeply unsettling. He had gained insight into the everyday reality of his employees, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, but it had come at the cost of his own comfort and naivety. What had once seemed like a simple observation was now a sobering reality. As he left the office that evening, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface. There was so much more to learn, so much more to understand. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure how much of it he was ready to face. The journey ahead was daunting, but one thing was certain. Marcus was no longer just the CEO of a company. He was a man confronting uncomfortable truths about himself, his success, and the system that had allowed him to rise. For the next several days, Marcus Hayes continued his undercover experiment, immersing himself deeper into the daily lives of his colleagues. He was determined to understand the true dynamics of his company from the ground level, and what he was witnessing was both eye-opening and deeply unsettling. The more he observed, the more he realized just how much he had taken for granted in his role as CEO. He had always assumed that success in his company was about merit, hard work, and results. But now, he was beginning to see how those assumptions didn't always hold true, especially for his employees from marginalized backgrounds. As Marcus spent more time working alongside the junior staff, he began to form relationships with them. They didn't know who he was, at least not yet, but Marcus found himself engaging in candid conversations with people he had never really spoken to before. It was a humbling experience. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't seen as the powerful, well-known CEO who made decisions from behind a polished desk. He was just another employee. And in many ways, that made the conversations he had more meaningful. People spoke freely around him, not knowing that he was the very man who shaped the company's policies, its direction, its culture. One morning, as Marcus sat at the small break table with a group of employees, he began to notice the exhaustion in their voices, a weariness that ran far deeper than the usual complaints about deadlines or long hours. Leah, a Black woman in her mid-30s, was the first to open up. She had been working at the company for nearly 5 years, and although she had an impressive resume and a stellar work ethic, she had been repeatedly passed over for promotions. Despite her qualifications, Leah had been stuck in the same role, while others, mostly white employees, had risen through the ranks with less experience and fewer credentials. It wasn't lost on her, and the bitterness in her voice was palpable as she explained the frustration she felt. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong," Leah said, her hands wrapped around a half-empty cup of coffee. "I've been here longer than some of these people, and I've been passed up for every promotion. Every single time. It's not even like they're giving me feedback. It's like they don't even think I'm capable of more." Her voice dropped lower, almost in a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. "I can't help but wonder if it's because I'm Black. Because every time someone else gets the job, they don't even seem as qualified as I am. But I keep getting passed over. No one says it, but it's hard not to think about it." Marcus could hear the frustration in her voice, but what struck him most was how resigned she seemed. Leah had become accustomed to the disappointment, and while she still tried to push forward, it was clear that she had begun to internalize the message that her hard work and talent weren't enough to overcome the invisible barriers in her path. She wasn't being held back by a lack of ability or effort. She was being held back by something far less tangible, something that no amount of qualifications or dedication could fix. Marcus didn't know what to say at first. As a CEO, he had always believed in meritocracy. Hard work, skill, and results were supposed to be the things that determined your success. But here was Leah, someone who had all those things being told, in effect, that it wasn't enough. It didn't matter how good she was. The rules of the game were different for her. "I hear you, Leah," Marcus finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. "And I know it must be incredibly frustrating. You deserve better than this. And I'll tell you something, I see you. I see how hard you work, and I know it's not going unnoticed." Leah gave him a small, thankful smile, but Marcus could tell she didn't fully believe him. The system had conditioned her to doubt words like that. She had heard them before, and they hadn't changed anything. But Marcus wasn't about to give up on her or anyone else. This conversation, this moment, was a wake-up call. It was one thing to read about systemic bias and inequity. It was another to hear it from someone who had been living it for years. He couldn't ignore the hurt in Leah's voice. And he couldn't pretend that the company, the one he had built, was as inclusive as he had thought it was. The next day, Marcus had another conversation, this time with Javier, a Hispanic man who had been working at the company for just over 3 years. Javier was a talented programmer who had been passed over for leadership opportunities on multiple occasions, despite his technical proficiency and his ability to manage complex projects. The story was the same as Leah's, but with different cultural nuances. Javier was given menial tasks, things that didn't challenge him, things that didn't make use of his skills. He was constantly told he lacked the confidence for leadership positions, despite his accomplishments and the fact that he had successfully managed teams in previous jobs. "You know, sometimes I think they don't even see me," Javier said, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "They see the name on my resume, and they immediately pigeonhole me. I've been stuck doing this same low-level stuff since I started here, and no one takes me seriously. I try to speak up in meetings, but they always cut me off, or worse, they ignore me. Then someone else says the exact same thing, and suddenly it's a great idea." Marcus listened carefully. He could hear the pain in Javier's words, but he also heard the anger that came with the sense of being invisible, being ignored, and not being seen for what he was, someone who had the talent and the ability to do much more than he was being allowed to do. "I get it, Javier," Marcus replied. "I really do. It's not fair. And it's not right. You deserve more than this, and I'll make sure someone sees that." Javier looked at him with a mix of disbelief and hope, as though he couldn't quite figure out if Marcus's words were just another empty platitude, or if there was a real commitment behind them. Marcus understood the skepticism. He had been on the other side of these conversations before, offering empty promises to employees who had long since stopped believing in the possibility of change. But Marcus wasn't offering empty promises. He was offering something far more important: his understanding, his empathy, and his commitment to fighting for these employees in a way that would make a real difference. He had always believed that the company was a place where talent was recognized, where hard work led to opportunities. But now he was seeing the cracks in that belief, and he couldn't ignore them. If he wanted to make real change, it would have to come from within, from the very culture that had allowed these inequities to persist. Over the next several days, Marcus began to take a more active role in supporting Leah and Javier, helping them with projects and offering advice when they needed it. It was a delicate balance. He had to be careful not to draw too much attention to himself or to reveal that he was the CEO, but he didn't mind the risk. It was worth it to see the difference his involvement made. Leah began to feel more confident in her abilities. She worked alongside Marcus on a challenging project that she had previously been told was too advanced for her, and she excelled. Javier, too, began to shine. When a senior executive questioned one of his ideas in a meeting, Marcus spoke up on his behalf, pushing for his idea to be taken seriously. Over time, Marcus began to notice a shift. The subtle, unspoken biases that had governed the way people interacted with him were also affecting the way they treated his colleagues. But Marcus was starting to see something else, something that wasn't as easily fixed with personal intervention. No matter how much he helped Leah or Javier, the systems in place still favored certain people over others. The hierarchical structure of the company, its hiring practices, its promotion cycles, its ingrained favoritism, was part of a much larger issue. It wasn't enough to simply give Leah more responsibility or to ensure Javier's ideas were heard in meetings. The company itself needed to change. And Marcus, now more than ever, was beginning to realize that he was the one who needed to lead that change. The conversations with Leah and Javier were just the beginning. He continued to listen to his colleagues, to understand their frustrations, and to support them in any way he could. But the deeper Marcus dug, the more he realized that the problem was systemic. It wasn't enough to provide a few more opportunities here and there. The biases were so deeply entrenched in the company's culture that they couldn't be eliminated with small acts of kindness or mentorship. True change would require a complete overhaul, a restructuring of the way the company viewed diversity, talent, and merit. Despite the growing realization that the problem was bigger than he had anticipated, Marcus felt a strange sense of camaraderie that he had never felt before. For the first time in years, he wasn't the figurehead, the revered leader. He was a peer, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had been overlooked, undervalued, and silenced. And in that shared struggle, Marcus began to feel a deeper connection to his colleagues than he ever had before. But as much as he wanted to believe that individual actions would be enough, Marcus knew deep down that the company's problems ran much deeper than he had initially realized. The system needed to change, and Marcus was the only one who could make that happen. He had seen enough. He had listened, learned, and understood. Now, it was time to take the next step. But he also knew that would require him to challenge everything he had built, everything he had taken for granted. And that was a daunting task. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Marcus had made a choice. He wasn't going to shy away from the challenge. He was going to face it head-on.
Because now he understood.
Real change would only come when the system itself was forced to adapt. And Marcus Hayes was ready to lead that transformation, no matter the cost. Weeks had passed since Marcus Hayes had started his undercover mission, and by now, he had experienced the true dynamics of his company in ways that were both sobering and illuminating. His early impressions had been validated. Despite the company's outward commitment to diversity and inclusion, the internal culture was still rife with subtle, systemic biases that favored certain employees over others based on race, class, and background. Marcus had witnessed how these dynamics played out day after day, how Black employees like Leah and Javier were continually passed over for opportunities, while their white counterparts moved up the ranks with little more than average performance. The inequities were undeniable, and they were rooted deep in the organizational culture. He had tried to make small but meaningful interventions in the lives of Leah, Javier, and other marginalized employees, but he realized that personal acts of support and mentorship, while important, were insufficient on their own. The real change needed to happen at the structural level. It was clear to Marcus that if he wanted to have a lasting impact, he would need to address the deep-seated issues in the company's hierarchy, its policies, and the ingrained biases that colored every decision from hiring to promotions to day-to-day interactions. The reality was that the biases weren't just affecting the bottom rung of the company, they were shaping the culture at every level. If things were ever going to change, it would require a bold shift in perspective. one that came from the top. And Marcus was uniquely positioned to lead that change. It was a Saturday evening when he decided to act. After weeks of gathering information, observing, and reflecting on his own experiences, Marcus felt a mounting sense of urgency. He knew the risks. He knew the backlash he could face, both in turn, ally from the leadership team and externally from the public. But he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence of inequality any longer. His conscience wouldn't let him turn a blind eye to what he had seen. More importantly, he knew the company's potential, its potential to truly be a leader in diversity and inclusion. He had seen the commitment of his employees, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, and he understood that if the company truly embraced diversity, it would be a stronger, more innovative organization for it. But to get there, it had to confront its own internal biases. And so, Marcus made his decision. The following Monday, he walked into the office like any other day, but this time, there was a different energy in him. It was time to bring everything he had learned to the forefront. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare him for what he was about to do. He had decided that the next company-wide meeting would be his platform. He would address the issues head-on, not as the CEO, but as someone who had walked in the shoes of those whose voices had been ignored. He would challenge the very structures that had allowed inequality to persist and force the leadership team to reckon with the truth of what had been happening under their watch. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, and as Marcus walked into the conference room, he could feel the weight of what he was about to do settle in his chest. The long table was filled with the usual faces, the senior leadership team, heads of departments, and a few high-ranking managers. The room buzzed with anticipation, as it always did before a company-wide meeting. They were used to hearing from Marcus, but this time, he was determined to say something different. For a moment, Marcus paused at the door, taking in the faces before him. He had worked with these people for years, many of them since the company's early days. They had shared in the highs and the lows, celebrated milestones together, and built the company's reputation from the ground up. Yet over the years, the distance between them had only grown. He was no longer one of them. He was the CEO, the figurehead, the decision-maker, and the weight of that role had often kept him from truly understanding the challenges his employees faced on the ground level. But now he had seen those challenges firsthand. Now he had the perspective he needed, and he couldn't sit idly by and let things continue as they had been. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable sense of urgency. "I wanted to take a moment today to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while now, something that I've seen for myself, and something that I can no longer ignore." He paused, looking around the room, gauging the reactions of his colleagues. They were listening intently, some of them no doubt wondering what was coming. "I've spent the last few weeks working alongside employees at all levels of the company," Marcus continued. "I've been in the trenches with people who are doing the hard work that keeps this company running, people who have been overlooked, underappreciated, and undervalued. And I've seen the ways in which our workplace culture doesn't just fail to support them, it actively marginalizes them. And I have to be honest with you, it's been eye-opening." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, watching the faces around the table. Some were shocked, others uneasy. They hadn't expected this kind of talk from their CEO. Marcus could see a few of the senior leaders exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. But he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "For too long," Marcus continued, "we've paid lip service to the idea of diversity and inclusion without addressing the real, underlying issues in our culture. We've implemented diversity training, we've updated our hiring practices, but when it comes to real, systemic change, when it comes to ensuring that every employee, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has equal access to opportunities, there's been little more than complacency. The fact is, we have a serious problem. A problem that's affecting people every single day. And we, as leaders, are responsible for it." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was the moment where he could either make a lasting change or risk alienating his team, perhaps irreparably. The silence in the room was palpable, but he knew he couldn't afford to stop now. We have employees who are consistently passed over for promotions, not because they lack the ability, but because they don't fit the mold of what we think leadership should look like. We have people in our company who are given menial tasks not because they aren't capable of more, but because of the biases that exist in the way we assess talent. And we have a culture that reinforces these biases, making it harder for some to rise while giving others a free pass. Marcus looked directly at the leadership team now, his eyes locking with those of his fellow executives. And I have to ask myself, how much of this is because of who I am? How much of my success has been due to merit, and how much of it is because I was a rare exception, a Black man who somehow made it to the top? I've had to ask myself these hard questions, and I think it's time that we all ask ourselves the same thing. The room remained still. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, but he pressed on. Look, I've seen the way some of our senior staff members interact with our junior employees. I've heard the offhand comments, the microaggressions, the dismissive attitudes toward those who don't fit the mold of what we think is successful. And I've seen it all in the context of my own success. I've benefited from being seen as an exception. But the fact is, I'm no exception. I'm not a one-off success story. The only thing that makes me different from some of the talented people we have here is that I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Marcus paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. This was his moment of reckoning. The conversation he had been avoiding for years had finally arrived. We can no longer pretend that these issues don't exist, he said, his voice growing more passionate. We need to change the way we operate. We need to be honest about the biases in our company and actively work to dismantle them. This isn't just about improving the culture. It's about ensuring that every single person in this room, every person in this company, has an equal chance to succeed, regardless of who they are or where they come from. He sat down, and for a long moment no one spoke. It was a tense silence, but Marcus felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to them to take action. Finally, the chief operating officer, who had been staring down at his tablet, looked up and cleared his throat. Marcus, we appreciate your candor. This is a tough conversation, but it's one that needs to happen. He paused, his voice thoughtful. We'll take your concerns seriously and work together to address them. We'll initiate an audit of our hiring and promotion practices, and we'll look at how we can improve training programs to better address these issues. Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the changes they were promising weren't going to be enough. There would be no quick fixes, no immediate solutions. But at least the conversation had begun. At least the seeds of change had been planted. As he left the room, he felt a mixture of hope and doubt. He knew that what he had done was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the changes would be slow. But he had done what he had set out to do. He had made the invisible visible. He had made sure that the leadership team could no longer ignore the reality that had been staring them in the face all along. And that, he knew, was the first step toward real change. After Marcus Hayes' bold move to address systemic racism and inequality at the company, things began to unravel in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The meeting had been a moment of catharsis, a rare and honest confrontation of the company's deepest flaws. He had hoped it would spark the kind of meaningful change that would ripple through the entire organization. But the aftermath proved far more complicated than he could have imagined. The days following his speech were a blend of public gestures and quiet, behind-the-scenes resistance. On the surface, things appeared to be moving in the right direction. The leadership team had nodded in agreement, promising to review the company's hiring practices, implement more inclusive leadership training, and develop stronger policies to combat bias. Some of the employees expressed a sense of relief, feeling that the long-standing issues that had been swept under the rug were finally being acknowledged. Marcus had hoped that these measures would be the first step in a broader transformation. But as the days passed, he began to feel the weight of the resistance building from within the company. At first, the opposition was subtle. It began with the small, passive-aggressive comments from senior management, especially from those who were most comfortable with the status quo. One morning, Marcus overheard a conversation between two of the company's top executives. As he passed by, one of them remarked, "I guess we'll have to start checking all our biases now, huh? I mean, if we don't, We'll get called out for it, right? It wasn't the joke that stung. It was the dismissive, almost cynical tone behind it. The implication was clear. These executives weren't taking Marcus' speech seriously. They were looking for ways to undermine it, to make it seem like just another corporate box to check off. This was followed by more subtle forms of exclusion. Marcus noticed that after his speech, some of the senior leadership began to withdraw from him. Conversations that had once been warm and collaborative now felt distant and perfunctory. At meetings, he was no longer met with the same eager attentiveness. Instead, his ideas were often dismissed or ignored altogether. He was starting to feel like a stranger in his own company, a figurehead who had become an inconvenient reminder of the inequities they preferred to avoid. But the real shift happened at a deeper, more insidious level. As Marcus made his way through the office, he began to sense a quiet skepticism from his colleagues, those employees who had been so inspired by his message of change. There were whispers in the hallways, uncertain glances exchanged during coffee breaks, and murmurs of doubt in the break rooms. Was he really one of us? One employee asked in hushed tones. I mean, he's the CEO. He's not like us. Can he really understand what we go through? The skepticism among the employees, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, cut deeper than anything Marcus had encountered. He had been so focused on confronting the biases of the leadership team that he hadn't fully anticipated how his actions would be perceived by the very people he had hoped to support. To them, he wasn't just a leader challenging the system, he was someone who had climbed to the top and was now trying to change the rules after the fact. He had once been one of them, but now he was something else. The divide between Marcus and his employees had grown even wider. It was Leah, the Black woman who had confided in Marcus about the difficulties of advancing in the company, who finally voiced what many had been thinking. They were sitting together in a small, quiet corner of the office one afternoon, taking a break from their respective work. Leah's eyes were tired, but there was an intensity behind her words when she spoke. You know, Marcus, I've been thinking about everything you said in that meeting, Leah began, her voice quiet but firm. And I really appreciated it. I thought you meant it. But now I'm not so sure. I don't know if you understand what it really feels like to be here, at the bottom. You've got all this power, all this influence, and suddenly you're trying to be one of us, but it's different now. We can't just forget that you're the CEO. We can't just forget the privileges that come with that. Marcus was taken aback. He had anticipated some resistance, but hearing it directly from Leah, who he had seen struggle for recognition, hit him hard. He had hoped that by making himself vulnerable, by stepping down from his CEO role and experiencing the office from the perspective of an entry-level employee, he would gain the trust of people like Leah. But what he hadn't realized was how his actions, while well-intentioned, might have alienated her and others who had hoped for more tangible, long-lasting change. Leah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it seem like I could just walk in and understand what you're going through, Marcus said, his voice filled with regret. I thought I could make a difference, but now I'm starting to realize that the changes we need can't be fixed just by me walking around in disguise. The system is much deeper than that. Leah shook her head. It's not just about you walking around in our shoes, Marcus. It's about the real work. It's about dismantling the structures that are built into this company. You can't just show up and expect things to change with a speech. We need actions, not more talk. And right now, it feels like you're just one more person who says the right things but isn't doing enough. Her words were a gut punch. Marcus had expected this in some form, but hearing it from someone he had come to respect so much made him question everything he thought he knew about leadership and the kind of change that was truly needed. The days that followed were filled with growing tension. Marcus tried to push forward with his vision, insisting that the company had to follow through with the commitments made during the meeting. But the resistance from senior leadership grew more pronounced. There were whispers of a backlash against the changes Marcus was proposing, with some executives arguing that the company was losing its edge by focusing too much on diversity initiatives. They claimed that the meritocracy of the company was being undermined and that the focus on diversity was starting to take away from the company's core mission of innovation and excellence. Marcus found himself constantly caught in the middle, trying to balance the pressures from both sides. He knew that if he pushed too hard, if he demanded too much too soon, he would alienate the people he was trying to change things for. But if he didn't push, if he allowed the status quo to persist, he would lose his integrity. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier. It wasn't just the leadership team that was resisting the changes. Marcus began to feel a sense of alienation from his own staff as well. The very people who had once rallied behind him were now skeptical of his motivations. Some questioned whether his sudden shift in focus was genuine or merely a calculated move to ease his conscience. The lack of immediate change was also breeding frustration, especially among the junior employees who had hoped that Marcus' speech would lead to concrete results. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through the office, he overheard a conversation between two of the company's junior employees. They were standing near the coffee machine, talking in hushed tones. "I don't know if I trust it," one of them said. "All this talk about diversity and inclusion, but nothing's changing. It's like they just want to look good on paper. Do you think Marcus is really going to do anything about it?" "I don't know," the other employee replied. "I want to believe him, but nothing's different yet. It's all talk." Their words stung. Marcus had hoped his speech would lead to immediate, visible change, but now he realized that it wasn't just about policy changes or new initiatives. It was about changing the very culture of the company. And that would take time. It would require not just his leadership, but the collective will of the entire organization to embrace it. But that kind of change was slow, painstaking work. And in the meantime, Marcus felt the walls closing in. His position as CEO had never felt so tenuous. As the days wore on, the emotional toll began to mount. Marcus was torn between the desire to make a real difference and the crushing weight of resistance from every direction. He was isolated from both the leadership team and his employees. His attempt to create an environment of honesty and transformation had left him feeling more alone than ever. The cost of his attempt to change the company's culture was becoming clear. It wasn't just the relationships with his peers that were fractured. It was his own sense of self, his belief in the power of leadership that was starting to erode. The more he pushed, the more the cracks in the company's foundation deepened. In the quiet of his office late one evening, Marcus sat alone at his desk, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had fought so hard to make a difference, but it felt as though he had paid a higher price than he had ever imagined. His actions, his attempts to push for change, had cost him more than just his comfort. They had cost him the trust and respect of the people who mattered most. And he wasn't sure if he could recover from it. In the quiet aftermath of Marcus Hayes' decision to expose himself as the CEO during the company-wide event, the silence in the room was deafening. The employees, who had spent weeks speculating about the identity of the mysterious new guy, were left in shock as Marcus peeled away the layers of his disguise. It wasn't just the revelation of his identity that shook them. It was the fact that, in that moment, Marcus had done something he had never done before. He had taken off his armor, revealing the vulnerability he had hidden for so long. What had started as an attempt to understand the company from the ground up had now become a full-fledged confrontation with the very system that had supported his rise. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. Some employees stared at Marcus with wide eyes, processing the enormity of his revelation. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond. A few, mostly those who had been part of the more cynical faction of the company, looked at each other, almost as if they had been proven right in their doubts. But then, slowly, as Marcus stood at the front of the room, his posture firm and resolute, a few employees began to clap. It was tentative at first, an uncertain, almost hesitant round of applause. But it grew louder as others joined in, the sound slowly building into something more solid, more affirming. Marcus held his ground, allowing the applause to wash over him, but his mind was already racing. This was the moment he had hoped would mark the beginning of true transformation. He had spoken passionately about the need for authenticity, accountability, and long-term change. He had exposed his own vulnerabilities, admitted that his previous actions hadn't gone far enough, and called for a collective effort to dismantle the barriers of systemic inequity in the company. But even as the applause echoed in the room, He knew that the real work was just beginning, and that the road ahead would be filled with even more challenges, more doubts, and more resistance than ever before. When the clapping died down, Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew that his next words had to be carefully considered, but they also had to come from a place of honesty. He couldn't afford to return to his old persona, the polished, confident CEO who could mask his emotions behind the mask of corporate leadership. No, this moment was about the truth, and about leading with the full weight of his experiences. "I'm not here to give you all the answers," Marcus began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'm not here to promise that everything will change overnight. But what I can promise is that we're going to work together, every single one of us, to make this company the place we all deserve it to be. And that starts with me. It starts with owning the reality of what has been happening here and what hasn't been happening here." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Many of them were still processing the shock of his revelation, but Marcus could see the glimmer of something new, hope, perhaps, or at least the beginnings of it. Some employees were nodding, others were leaning forward, eager to hear what would come next. "I know that I've been insulated by my position," Marcus continued, "and that insulation has afforded me privileges that I never fully understood. I know that as the CEO, I've been able to escape some of the very things that the majority of you face every day. But today, I've seen what I've never seen before, and I can't unsee it. I can't ignore it." The words hung in the air for a moment. Marcus could feel the weight of them settle over the room, a heavy but necessary truth. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for my past ignorance," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm asking you to join me in creating a future where we, all of us, can thrive. Where we don't just talk about diversity, we live it. Where we don't just promise equal opportunity, we make it a reality." The aftermath of the event was, in many ways, a continuation of the journey that Marcus had set himself on. In the days that followed, there were conversations, questions, and even some frustration. The employees who had once been his peers seemed divided. Some were energized by his honesty, ready to embrace the changes he had promised. Others, however, were deeply skeptical. They had lived through years of corporate initiatives that had promised change, only for those initiatives to fizzle out after a few months or even weeks. The cynicism was hard to ignore, and it was clear that Marcus had a long way to go before he could regain the trust of all his colleagues. As Marcus navigated the fallout of his revelation, he began to see just how deep the roots of resistance ran. It wasn't just the senior leadership team that was hesitant to embrace change. It was the very fabric of the company's culture. The company had been built on a foundation of meritocracy, on the idea that success came from hard work and talent alone. But that was a myth, one that Marcus had only begun to dismantle. Success, he had come to realize, was a product of both individual effort and the systems that either nurtured or stifled that effort. And the company's systems had been set up to favor certain groups over others. It was during a conversation with one of his senior executives, Robert, that Marcus fully understood the scale of the challenge that lay ahead. Robert had been with the company for years and had risen through the ranks on the strength of his merit, or so he believed. Robert had always been supportive of Marcus, but lately, there had been a growing tension between them. Robert was a man of tradition, deeply invested in the company's legacy and the way things had always been done. As the two sat in Marcus' office, the conversation took a turn. "Marcus, I get where you're coming from," Robert said, his voice low. "I do. But you've got to understand something. This company wasn't built on diversity. It wasn't built on political correctness. It was built on results. We've worked hard to create an environment where the best people rise to the top, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Marcus felt a flash of frustration. "That's the problem, Robert," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "You're talking about results without acknowledging the fact that some people have been shut out of that system from the very beginning. The best people don't always get the opportunity to rise to the top, especially if they don't fit the mold. That's what I'm trying to change." Robert shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not saying we don't need to do better," he said, his tone defensive. "But the way you're going about it, it's risky. It's going to alienate a lot of people." And we need people on board if we're going to make this work. Marcus met Robert's gaze. I'm willing to take that risk, he said quietly, because I'm not doing this for the people who are already in power. I'm doing it for the people who've been overlooked, the people who've been made to feel invisible. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself entrenched in the complex, messy work of changing a culture. There were moments of triumph, small victories that gave him hope. He saw his employees beginning to open up, having candid conversations about race and opportunity, about bias and exclusion. But there were also setbacks, times when the old ways reasserted themselves, when resistance from senior leaders felt insurmountable. But Marcus refused to back down. He had come too far, had risked too much, to let the status quo in. He had already taken the first step toward dismantling the systemic barriers that had long held his company back. Now, he had to take the next step, and the one after that. He couldn't afford to be discouraged by the slow pace of change, or by the skepticism that still lingered in the halls of his company. What he had learned was that transformation wasn't a singular moment of revelation. It was a process, a long, difficult, and often uncomfortable process. And it had to start with him. One evening, as Marcus stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city that had been the backdrop to his success, he realized that the journey he had started wasn't over. It had just begun. The path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but it was a path he was willing to walk. And this time, he wasn't walking it alone. He was leading with the full weight of his experience, with the understanding that real change could only come when everyone, every single one of them, was willing to change together. And that, Marcus knew, was the only way forward.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.